She looked like any ordinary passenger in seat 2A, reading quietly during the routine flight to New York. Nobody knew her true identity or legendary reputation when the Boeing 777's engines exploded at 35,000 feet, killing systems and knocking out the crew. Two F-22 stealth fighters broke strict radio silence just to honor her call sign. Commander Rachel, Phoenix, Torres adjusted her position in seat 2A of transatlantic Flight 892, finally allowing herself to relax after 3 exhausting weeks at Edwards Air Force Base. The classified test flights she had been conducting pushed both aircraft and pilot to their absolute limits, exploring flight regimes that existed only in theory until she proved they could work in reality. She wore simple civilian clothes, jeans, a white blouse, and comfortable sneakers. Nothing in her appearance suggested that she was one of the Air Force's most elite test pilots, holder of multiple speed and altitude records and the author of flight test procedures that had revolutionized military aviation. To the other passengers, she looked like any other business traveler heading from Los Angeles to New York on this Tuesday afternoon. The Boeing 777-300ER was a magnificent aircraft, one of the most advanced commercial airliners ever built. It carried 200 souls through crystal-clear skies at 35,000 feet, cruising at 545 miles per hour toward their destination. The massive twin-engine aircraft was a marvel of engineering, with systems so sophisticated that it could practically fly itself. Captain David Morrison, a 20-year veteran of commercial aviation, and First Officer Jennifer Park, who had joined the airline 5 years earlier after military service as a Navy pilot, handled the routine transcontinental flight with practiced ease. Both were highly experienced aviators who had handled countless flights across the country and around the world. Flight attendants moved efficiently through the cabin, serving drinks and snacks to passengers who read books, watched movies on their personal devices, or slept peacefully in their seats. The cabin was quiet except for the gentle hum of the engines and the occasional conversation between passengers. Rachel had closed her eyes and was trying to forget about the experimental aircraft she had been testing for the past 3 weeks. The X-47 prototype she had been flying was so classified that even thinking about it in public made her uncomfortable. The aircraft could pull G-forces that would kill most pilots, perform maneuvers that seemed to violate the laws of physics, and reach speeds and altitudes that pushed the very boundaries of what was possible with current technology. During her last test flight just 2 days earlier, she had taken the X-47 to 95,000 feet and accelerated to Mach 4.2, faster than any human had ever flown in a piloted aircraft. The experience was both exhilarating and terrifying, requiring split-second decisions and control inputs that existed at the very limits of human capability. But today she was just another passenger, tired from weeks of intense work and looking forward to a few days of leave in New York before returning to Edwards for the next phase of testing. No call signs, no experimental aircraft, no life or death decisions at impossible speeds and altitudes. That peaceful anonymity lasted exactly 2 hours, 14 minutes, and 37 seconds after takeoff. Rachel felt the subtle change in engine pitch before anyone else on the aircraft noticed anything unusual. Her years of flight testing had made her extraordinarily sensitive to any variation in aircraft behavior, any sound that was even slightly different from normal. The change was so small that most people wouldn't have detected it, but to Rachel's trained ear it was as obvious as a fire alarm. Something was wrong with the number 2 engine. She opened her eyes and listened more carefully. The vibration pattern through the airframe was slightly irregular, and there was a barely perceptible change in the aircraft's trim that suggested an asymmetric thrust condition. Her mind automatically began running through possibilities: partial power loss, compressor problems, or worse. Captain Morrison's voice came over the passenger address system about 30 seconds later, calm and professional but with an undertone that Rachel recognized as controlled concern. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Morrison speaking. We're experiencing a minor technical issue with one of our engines. As a precautionary measure, we're going to descend to a lower altitude and adjust our route slightly. This is standard procedure, and there's no cause for alarm. Please remain seated with your seat belts securely fastened. We'll have you back on course shortly." Rachel knew it wasn't minor. The combination of sounds and sensations she was detecting indicated something much more serious than a routine technical issue: the slight change in power settings, the barely perceptible shift in the aircraft's attitude, the subtle increase in vibration. These were signs of significant trouble developing. In the cockpit, Morrison and Park were facing a rapidly evolving nightmare scenario. What had started as a routine engine parameter warning had quickly escalated into something much more serious. The number 2 engine's exhaust gas temperature had spiked suddenly, followed by multiple caution and warning indications. Engine 2 EGT is redlining, Park reported, her voice tight with professional stress as she scanned the engine instruments. Oil pressure is dropping, and I'm seeing metal particles in the oil. Morrison's hands moved quickly over the engine controls, following procedures he had practiced hundreds of times in the simulator but had never faced in real life. Starting engine 2 shutdown procedures. This looks like it could be an uncontained failure. Before Park could respond, the number 2 engine exploded. The massive General Electric GE90 engine, weighing over 18,000 pounds and generating 110,000 pounds of thrust at takeoff power, suffered a catastrophic uncontained failure that sent high-energy metal fragments in all directions. Pieces of turbine blades traveling at supersonic speeds punched through the engine cell and into the wing structure. The aircraft shuddered violently, as if it had been struck by lightning. Warning lights illuminated across every panel in the cockpit, and master caution and warning tones filled the flight deck with urgent electronic sounds. The aircraft immediately began pulling to the right as the engine's thrust disappeared and drag increased dramatically. Jesus Christ! Morrison fought with the flight controls as the Boeing 777 tried to roll right. We've lost engine 2 completely. I'm seeing multiple system failures. Park's training as a former military pilot served her well as she began working through the cascade of emergency checklists. Primary hydraulic system is gone. Backup hydraulics showing problems. We have fuel leaks in the right wing, and I'm seeing electrical failures throughout the aircraft. The metal fragments from the exploded engine had done more than just destroy the power plant. They had severed hydraulic lines, punctured fuel tanks, cut electrical cables, and damaged flight control surfaces. The sophisticated Boeing 777 was rapidly becoming a barely controllable flying machine. Declare an emergency, Morrison ordered as he struggled to maintain level flight. We need immediate vectors to the nearest airport with emergency equipment standing by. Park keyed the radio with trembling fingers. Los Angeles Center, Transatlantic 892. Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. We have suffered an uncontained engine failure with multiple system casualties. We are declaring an emergency and requesting immediate vectors to the nearest suitable airport. The response from Los Angeles Center came back immediately, the controller's voice crisp and professional despite the gravity of the situation. Transatlantic 892, Los Angeles Center. We copy your Mayday call. Roger, we show you about 180 miles southeast of Las Vegas. McCarran International Airport is your closest suitable facility. Turn right, heading 045. Emergency equipment is being notified and will be standing by. But even as Morrison began the turn toward Las Vegas, both pilots knew they had much bigger problems than just reaching an airport. The aircraft was becoming increasingly difficult to control, and they were losing altitude at a rate that made their arrival at any airport questionable. The Boeing 777's sophisticated fly-by-wire flight control system was designed to compensate for various failures, but the damage from the engine explosion had overwhelmed the aircraft's ability to maintain normal flight characteristics. Warning messages scrolled continuously across the cockpit displays, indicating failures in systems that the pilots had never seen fail simultaneously. Flight controls are getting mushy, Morrison reported through gritted teeth. I'm having to use a lot of force to maintain heading and altitude. Fuel system is showing massive leaks from the right wing, Park added. We're losing fuel fast. At this rate, we might not have enough to reach Las Vegas. Morrison keyed the radio again. Los Angeles Center, Transatlantic 892. We need immediate priority handling. Our situation is deteriorating rapidly. Multiple system failures, fuel leaks, and we're having difficulty controlling the aircraft. Transatlantic 892, you have priority handling. All other traffic is being vectored clear of your route. Las Vegas emergency equipment is rolling. Medical personnel and fire suppression are standing by. Over the next 10 minutes, Morrison and Park's situation continued to deteriorate at an alarming rate. More systems failed as electrical fires spread through the aircraft's wiring, the the smell of smoke began filtering into the cockpit, and Park started feeling lightheaded from the toxic fumes. The passengers in the cabin could sense that something was terribly wrong. The aircraft was shaking more violently than normal turbulence. Oxygen masks had deployed automatically when cabin pressure dropped due to structural damage, and the acrid smell of smoke was becoming noticeable throughout the passenger compartment. Flight attendants moved through the cabin trying to maintain calm and assist passengers with their oxygen masks, but fear was beginning to spread as people realized this was not a routine emergency. Some passengers were praying, others were calling loved ones on their cell phones, and a few were crying as they contemplated the possibility that they might not survive. Rachel had put on her oxygen mask and was analyzing the situation with the trained eye of a test pilot who had faced life-threatening emergencies many times before. The combination of sounds, vibrations, and the aircraft's flight behavior told her a story that was becoming increasingly desperate. The Boeing 777 was flying, but barely. The pilots were fighting to maintain control of an aircraft that was damaged far beyond what normal emergency procedures were designed to handle. She could feel the irregular control inputs as the pilot struggled with systems that were failing faster than they could compensate for them. Then everything got much worse. First, Officer Park suddenly slumped forward in her seat, her hands falling away from the controls and her head dropping toward the instrument panel. Morrison looked over, alarmed, and saw that his first officer was unconscious, overcome by smoke inhalation from the electrical fires spreading throughout the aircraft. Jennifer, respond." Morrison shook her shoulder, but Park didn't respond. Her breathing was shallow but steady, indicating that she was alive but incapacitated by the toxic fumes filling the cockpit. Morrison was now alone, flying a crippled aircraft with 200 lives depending entirely on his ability to keep the machine in the air long enough to reach an airport. The Boeing 777 was a sophisticated aircraft that normally required 2 pilots to operate safely, but it was never designed to fly with this many simultaneous failures and only one conscious pilot. Morrison keyed the radio, desperation creeping into his professional composure. "Mayday, Mayday. This is Transatlantic 892. I've lost my first officer to smoke inhalation. Multiple systems are continuing to fail, and I'm losing control authority. I need immediate assistance." Los Angeles Center immediately began coordinating with military and civilian authorities to provide any possible assistance, but there was little they could do for an aircraft that was barely controllable and still 150 miles from the nearest airport. Over the next 15 minutes, Morrison's situation deteriorated from desperate to seemingly impossible. More systems failed as electrical fires spread throughout the aircraft. The flight controls became increasingly unresponsive, requiring enormous physical effort just to maintain basic control. The fuel leaks were getting worse, and Morrison realized they might run out of fuel before reaching Las Vegas. In the passenger cabin, people were beginning to panic as the situation became obviously life-threatening. The aircraft was shaking violently, the smell of smoke was getting stronger, and everyone could sense that they were in mortal danger. Rachel unbuckled her seat belt and stood up, moving forward through the chaotic cabin toward the cockpit. Flight attendants were trying to maintain order and help passengers, but the situation was clearly beyond normal emergency procedures. A senior flight attendant named Margaret Chen tried to intercept Rachel as she moved toward the front of the aircraft. "Ma'am, I need you to return to your seat and keep your seat belt fastened. We're in an emergency situation." Rachel looked at the flight attendant with the calm, steady gaze of someone who had faced death many times and survived through skill and determination. "I'm a pilot. Military test pilot. I might be able to help." Margaret hesitated for just a moment, studying Rachel's face and seeing something there that convinced her this wasn't a panicked passenger trying to interfere. "Follow me." Rachel reached the cockpit door just as Morrison was making another increasingly desperate radio call to air traffic control. Through the reinforced door, she could hear the chaos inside, multiple alarms sounding, equipment failing, and one pilot trying to handle an impossible situation while his unconscious first officer slumped in her seat. Rachel knocked firmly on the cockpit door. "Captain Morrison, this is Commander Torres, United States Air Force. I'm a test pilot with extensive experience in emergency situations. Request permission to assist." Morrison's voice came back immediately, filled with relief at the possibility of help from someone who might understand what he was facing. "Get in here right now." Rachel entered the cockpit and immediately began assessing the situation with the trained eye of someone who had spent years dealing with aircraft in extreme emergency conditions. First Officer Park was unconscious but breathing steadily, slumped forward in her seat with her oxygen mask askew. Captain Morrison was fighting with flight controls that were barely responding to his inputs, his face covered in sweat from the physical effort and stress of trying to keep the aircraft flying. Warning lights covered every panel in the cockpit like a Christmas tree from hell, and master caution and warning tones provided a constant electronic symphony of emergency alerts. The aircraft was clearly flying far outside its normal operational envelope, held aloft only by Morrison's skill and determination. "What's your current status?" Rachel asked calmly as she slipped into the observer seat behind the two pilots, immediately beginning to analyze the situation. "Uncontained failure of Engine 2 took out multiple systems," Morrison reported quickly, his voice strained from the physical effort of controlling the aircraft. "We've lost primary hydraulics completely. Backup hydraulics are failing. Massive fuel leaks from the right wing. Electrical fires throughout the aircraft. And flight controls are barely responding." Rachel's mind immediately shifted into the analytical mode that had kept her alive during countless test flights of experimental aircraft. She had faced situations where prototype aircraft were failing in ways that designers had never anticipated, requiring split-second decisions and unconventional solutions that existed nowhere in any manual. "What systems do you still have operational?" "Engine 1 is still running but showing signs of damage from debris. Some electrical power from the backup generators. Manual reversion on flight controls, but I'm having to use enormous force to get any response." Rachel studied the instrument displays, drawing on years of experience with aircraft that were barely controllable or flying in configurations that violated every principle of normal flight operations. The Boeing 777's condition reminded her of test flights where she had deliberately put experimental aircraft into extreme situations to explore the boundaries of controllable flight. "We need to stop thinking about this as a normal aircraft emergency," Rachel told Morrison. "This is now an experimental flight test situation. We're going to fly this aircraft using techniques that aren't in any commercial aviation manual." "I don't understand what you mean. I've spent years flying aircraft that weren't supposed to be able to fly, prototypes with systems failing, experimental configurations that existed at the limits of aerodynamic possibility. This aircraft is now in that category, and we need to treat it accordingly." Rachel began issuing instructions based on techniques she had developed during years of experimental test flying. Instead of fighting against the aircraft's damaged condition, she had Morrison work with the limitations imposed by the failures. "Reduce power on Engine 1 to 70%, she instructed. "We're going to use the asymmetric thrust condition to help with directional control instead of fighting against it." Morrison followed her instructions and immediately felt the aircraft become slightly more manageable as they stopped fighting the thrust asymmetry and started using it as a control input. "Now forget about trying to fly this like a normal Boeing 777. The flight control system is damaged beyond normal operational parameters. We need to use elevator trim for pitch control instead of trying to muscle the primary controls." Over the next 20 minutes, Rachel guided Morrison through flying techniques that no commercial pilot had ever been trained to use. She drew on her experience with experimental aircraft that existed at the very boundaries of controllable flight, where conventional techniques were inadequate and survival depended on understanding aerodynamics at a fundamental level. These were techniques she had developed during test flights of aircraft deliberately configured to be barely controllable, exploring flight regimes that existed in the gray areas between normal flight and complete loss of control. She had learned to fly aircraft that were missing control surfaces, had asymmetric configurations, or were damaged in ways that made normal flight impossible. Meanwhile, 50 miles to the northeast, two F-22 Raptor stealth fighters were conducting highly classified training exercises over the Nevada desert. Major Sarah, Viper, Chen and Captain Mike, Razor, Williams were flying in complete radio silence, practicing deep penetration techniques that required absolute stealth and communication discipline. The F-22 Raptors were the most advanced fighter aircraft ever built, capable of supercruise flight at altitudes and speeds that made them virtually undetectable to enemy radar systems. Their current training mission simulated infiltrating heavily defended airspace without being detected, a scenario that required maintaining complete radio silence for hours at a time. Radio silence was not just preferred during these exercises, it was mandatory. Any transmission could potentially compromise their position and reveal capabilities that were among the most closely guarded secrets in the U.S. military. The pilots were trained to maintain communication discipline even in emergency situations unless absolutely necessary for survival. But their sophisticated sensor systems were capable of monitoring civilian air traffic control frequencies even while maintaining their own operational silence. The F-22's advanced avionics package included sensors that could detect and analyze electronic emissions from hundreds of miles away, and both pilots had been monitoring the increasingly desperate transmissions from transatlantic 892 as the situation deteriorated. They could track the aircraft's position and flight path through their sensors, watching as the damaged airliner struggled to maintain altitude and heading toward Las Vegas. Razor, Viper, Chen called on their discrete tactical frequency, encrypted and undetectable to civilian receivers. Are you monitoring the civilian emergency on frequency 121.5? Copy, Viper. I've been tracking it for the last 20 minutes. Someone on that airliner is coordinating recovery procedures that sound very familiar. Those aren't standard commercial aviation techniques. Through their advanced sensor systems, they could monitor not just the radio transmissions but also track the actual flight path of the Boeing 777. The aircraft was flying in ways that seemed impossible given the damage reports they had heard over the radio. Viper had extensive experience with post-stall maneuvering and unconventional flight techniques from her time as a test pilot before joining the operational F-22 community, and what she was observing from the civilian airliner looked like advanced test pilot techniques that existed far beyond normal commercial aviation training. Razor, whoever is flying that aircraft knows things that aren't taught in civilian schools. Those are military test pilot procedures. Copy that. Should we break silence and offer assistance? This question represented one of the most difficult decisions either pilot had ever faced. Breaking radio silence would immediately compromise their training exercise and potentially reveal classified capabilities that needed to remain secret. F-22 operations were among the most sensitive activities in the military, and unauthorized transmissions could have serious national security implications. On the other hand, 200 civilian lives were at stake, and someone on that aircraft was demonstrating flying skills that suggested they might be military personnel who deserved support from their fellow aviators. Military doctrine was clear about priorities. Human life took precedence over operational security in most circumstances, but the decision to break radio silence during a classified exercise was not one to be made lightly. Back on transatlantic 892, Rachel continued coaching Morrison through procedures that pushed the Boeing 777 far beyond its design limitations, using techniques she had developed during experimental test flights that existed in the gray areas between controlled flight and aerodynamic impossibility. "We're still losing altitude too fast," Morrison reported, his voice showing the strain of physical and mental exhaustion from fighting with barely controllable flight systems. "At this rate we won't make Las Vegas. We need to reduce our sink rate, but we're already at minimum controllable airspeed." Rachel calculated quickly in her head, running through options that existed outside normal flight envelopes. In a standard aircraft with normal systems, they would indeed be out of options, but her experience with experimental aircraft had taught her about flight regimes that existed beyond conventional operating limits. There were areas of flight that conventional wisdom said were impossible, regions where aircraft shouldn't be able to maintain controlled flight, but physics still applied in those regions, and if you understood the aerodynamics well enough, it was sometimes possible to maintain some degree of control even in post-stall flight conditions. "We're going to try something that isn't in any manual," Rachel told Morrison. "I need you to trust me completely and follow my instructions exactly, even if they seem to violate everything you've been taught about flying." Morrison looked at her with a mixture of desperation and hope. "At this point I'll try anything. Standard procedures aren't working." Rachel had Morrison configure the aircraft in a way that violated every principle of commercial aviation training. She had him increase the angle of attack beyond normal stall limits, use asymmetric power settings that would normally result in loss of control, and make control inputs that should have resulted in an immediate departure from controlled flight. Instead, the Boeing 777 entered a flight regime that existed in the margins of aerodynamic theory. The aircraft was technically in a stalled condition according to conventional definitions, but Rachel was managing the airflow around the wings and control surfaces to maintain some degree of control authority. How is this possible? Morrison asked in amazement as he felt the aircraft's sink rate decrease dramatically while somehow maintaining directional control. Post-stall maneuvering, Rachel explained. It's a technique developed for military test aircraft. The wing is stalled in the conventional sense, but we're managing the separated airflow to maintain some control effectiveness. The aircraft is flying in a region that civilian training says is impossible. The technique required constant, precise control inputs to maintain the delicate balance between controlled flight and complete departure from the flight envelope, methods Rachel had learned during test flights of experimental aircraft deliberately pushed beyond normal limits to explore the boundaries of what was possible. The F-22 pilots monitoring the situation were astounded by what they were observing. Viper had extensive experience with post-stall maneuvering in fighter aircraft, but she had never seen these techniques attempted in a large commercial airliner. Razor. That's advanced test pilot stuff, classified at most levels. Whoever is flying that bird has access to flight test techniques that are only taught at Edwards and Pax River. Copy that. This is definitely military-trained personnel. The question is whether we break silence to offer support. Viper made a command decision that would later be studied in military leadership courses. We're breaking silence. The situation justifies compromising our exercise. 200 civilian lives outweigh operational security considerations. She switched her radio to the emergency frequency. Transatlantic 892 was using and made a transmission that would end their classified training exercise but potentially save lives. Transatlantic 892, this is Viper Flight. 2 F-22 Raptors monitoring your situation. We have been observing advanced maneuvering techniques that suggest military pilot training. What are the qualifications of your current pilot? In the cockpit of the airliner, Morrison was surprised to hear from military aircraft he hadn't known were in the area. Rachel, however, immediately understood the implications of the transmission. F-22 Raptors didn't break radio silence lightly, especially during what was obviously a training exercise, and the fact that they were willing to compromise their mission to offer assistance showed the respect military aviators had for each other. Rachel took the radio microphone from Morrison. Viper Flight, this is Commander Rachel Torres, call sign Phoenix, Air Force Test Pilot School graduate. I'm assisting with emergency flight procedures. There was a moment of complete silence on the frequency. Then Viper's voice came back, filled with recognition and professional respect. Phoenix, Commander Rachel Torres. Ma'am, this is Major Chen, call sign Viper. We've studied your test reports at the Fighter Weapons School. Your work on high-alpha flight regimes and post-stall maneuvering fundamentally changed how we approach unconventional flight techniques. Razor's voice joined the conversation, equally filled with respect. Ma'am, this is Captain Williams, call sign Razor. Your research on asymmetric thrust control and damage tolerance saved my life during a training accident at Nellis last year. The techniques you developed are now standard curriculum for all F-22 pilots. Rachel felt a mixture of professional pride and overwhelming responsibility. Her fellow aviators recognized her contributions to military aviation, but right now the only thing that mattered was getting 200 innocent people safely on the ground. I appreciate the recognition, Viper Flight, but we have 200 souls aboard this aircraft and we're still not certain we can make it to a runway. We need all the support we can get. Understood completely, Phoenix. We're immediately coordinating with air traffic control and military authorities to provide maximum assistance. You'll have priority handling and emergency support all the way to Las Vegas. The F-22 pilots used their advanced communication systems and military command authority to coordinate with both civilian and military agencies. Within minutes, every other aircraft in the region had been diverted to alternative routes. Emergency equipment was being positioned at McCarran International Airport, and military search and rescue assets were being prepared for immediate launch if needed. The pilots also used their sensors to provide detailed tracking information about the Boeing 777's position and flight path, giving air traffic controllers more precise information than civilian radar could provide. For the next hour, Rachel continued flying the damaged airliner using techniques that existed nowhere in commercial aviation manuals, guiding Morrison through maneuvers that kept the aircraft flying despite failures that should have been absolutely insurmountable. The Boeing 777 was operating in flight conditions that were theoretically impossible, kept aloft only by Rachel's expert application of aerodynamic principles that existed at the very limits of controlled flight. Every control input required precise timing and exact magnitude to prevent the aircraft from departing completely from controlled flight. The F-22s maintained a discreet escort at a distance that kept them invisible to civilian radar but close enough to monitor the situation and provide immediate assistance if needed. They couldn't physically help with the flying, but their presence and coordination efforts ensured that everything possible was being done to support the emergency. As they approached Las Vegas, Rachel faced the most critical challenge yet. Landing a severely damaged aircraft with minimal control authority would require precision flying that existed at the very limits of human capability and aircraft performance. The approach to McCarran International Airport would normally be routine for an experienced airline crew, but with damaged flight controls, asymmetric thrust, and systems that barely functioned, it would require flying skills that few pilots in the world possessed. Morrison, the landing approach is going to be unlike anything you've trained for in your entire career, Rachel explained as they began their descent toward Las Vegas. I need you to follow my instructions exactly, without hesitation, even if they seem wrong. I'm completely with you, Commander. You've kept us alive this long. Rachel configured the approach using parameters that violated every standard operating procedure in commercial aviation: a higher than normal approach speed to maintain control authority, an unusual descent angle that compensated for the aircraft's damaged condition, and power settings that would normally be considered dangerous in an approach environment. But these techniques were specifically designed for aircraft that couldn't fly normally. Rachel was treating the Boeing 777 like an experimental prototype on its first flight, using every technique she had learned during years of test flying aircraft that existed at the boundaries of controllable flight. The approach required constant adjustments, as the aircraft's damaged systems created unpredictable responses to control inputs. Rachel had to anticipate how the aircraft would react and make corrections before problems developed, flying several steps ahead of the aircraft's actual condition. The F-22 pilots watched the approach with professional admiration and growing tension. They knew better than most how difficult this landing would be, and they were prepared to immediately coordinate search and rescue efforts if the landing went wrong. Phoenix, this is Viper. That's some of the finest flying any of us have ever witnessed. You're making the impossible look routine. Thanks for the support, Viper Flight. Keep those rescue assets ready, just in case. The landing was a masterpiece of precision flying under impossible conditions. Rachel guided Morrison through a touchdown that was firm but controlled, absorbing the impact of landing with damaged landing gear and compromised structural integrity. The aircraft bounced once but settled onto the runway and began slowing down. But the emergency wasn't over yet. With damaged braking systems and asymmetric drag from the destroyed engine, stopping the aircraft required techniques that existed nowhere in standard procedures. Rachel had Morrison use reverse thrust from the remaining engine, asymmetric braking that compensated for the damaged systems, and aerodynamic techniques that helped slow the aircraft without relying entirely on mechanical systems. The Boeing 777 used almost the entire length of McCarran's longest runway before finally coming to a stop just short of the overrun area. Emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft immediately, with fire suppression equipment, medical personnel, and rescue teams ready for any eventuality. As soon as the aircraft stopped moving, Rachel helped Morrison shut down all systems in the proper sequence to minimize fire risk and prepare for immediate evacuation. The cockpit was filled with smoke from electrical fires, and both pilots needed to get out quickly. "Commander, I can't begin to thank you," Morrison said as they prepared to evacuate. "Without your help, everyone on this aircraft would have died. You saved 200 lives today." "You did the flying, Captain," Rachel replied. "I just offered some suggestions based on my experience with difficult aircraft." "That was more than suggestions. That was flying I didn't know was possible. You turned an impossible situation into a successful landing." The evacuation proceeded smoothly, with passengers using emergency slides to exit the aircraft quickly. Medical personnel checked everyone for injuries from smoke inhalation and the stress of the emergency, but amazingly, everyone survived with only minor injuries. Outside the aircraft, the F-22s made one final pass over the airport before returning to their base. Before they departed, Viper made one last transmission on the emergency frequency. Phoenix, this is Viper Flight. What you accomplished today represents the very highest standards of military aviation. Your flying skills and decision-making under pressure will be studied and remembered throughout the aviation community. It was an honor to support your mission. Thank you, Viper Flight. The honor was mine. Safe flying, and thanks for breaking silence to help us out. The incident made international news within hours. Video from passengers, cell phones showed the terrifying moments when the aircraft seemed completely out of control, followed by the miraculous recovery that saved everyone aboard. But the full story of Rachel's role was initially classified while military officials reviewed what techniques had been revealed and what operational security implications existed from the F-22 pilot's decision to break radio silence during a classified exercise. Captain Morrison gave extensive interviews to aviation media, praising the mysterious Air Force officer who had appeared when needed most and demonstrated flying skills that seemed impossible. However, he was instructed not to reveal her name or specific qualifications pending the military's security review. The investigation into the incident took several weeks and involved multiple agencies. The National Transportation Safety Board examined every aspect of the aircraft failure and emergency response. The Air Force reviewed the techniques that had been used and their potential classification levels. The F-22 pilot's decision to break radio silence was examined by military leadership. The conclusions were unanimous across all investigating agencies. The emergency had fully justified all actions taken, including the use of experimental flight techniques and the F-22 pilot's decision to compromise their training exercise. The techniques Rachel had used should be studied for potential inclusion in both military and civilian emergency training programs. More importantly, the F-22 pilot's decision to break radio silence was officially commended by the highest levels of military leadership. Their judgment in prioritizing human life over operational security protocols held up as an example of proper military decision-making and the values that define military service. Rachel was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for her actions, one of the highest decorations for aviation achievement. Her techniques were immediately incorporated into advanced pilot training programs across all military services, and civilian aviation authorities requested her assistance in developing new emergency procedures. The incident also led to significant changes in both military and civilian aviation training. Rachel worked directly with the Federal Aviation Administration to develop new emergency procedures based on her experience with experimental aircraft, giving commercial pilots tools for handling situations that exceeded normal training parameters. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact was on the relationship between military and civilian aviation communities. The F-22 pilots' willingness to compromise their own classified mission to support a civilian emergency created new protocols for cooperation during crisis situations. The Boeing 777 that had nearly crashed was eventually repaired and returned to service after extensive structural work and systems replacement. Transatlantic Airlines officially renamed the aircraft Phoenix in honor of the pilot who had saved it, and Captain Morrison requested permanent assignment to that specific aircraft for the remainder of his career. On every flight, Morrison would brief his passengers about the aircraft's history and the remarkable flying that had saved 200 lives. He never failed to mention that sometimes heroes appear exactly when you need them most, armed with skills and knowledge that seem impossible until they prove that impossible is just another word for techniques that haven't been learned yet. 6 months later, Rachel returned to her test pilot duties at Edwards Air Force Base, continuing to push the boundaries of flight and develop new techniques that would keep America's military pilots safe in future conflicts. But she also spent significant time at civilian pilot training centers, teaching experienced airline and corporate pilots the advanced techniques that had saved Transatlantic 892. Her courses became legendary in the aviation community, known for covering flying skills that existed nowhere else in civilian training. The F-22 pilots who had broken radio silence were both promoted ahead of schedule and became senior instructors at the Air Force's Elite Fighter Weapons School. They used the transatlantic 892 incident as a case study in decision-making under pressure, showing how proper judgment sometimes required breaking rules to serve higher principles. Major Chen eventually became Colonel Chen and took command of her own F-22 squadron. In her office hung a framed photograph of a Boeing 777 landing safely at McCarran International Airport, with the inscription, "Sometimes the best military mission is saving civilian lives." Captain Williams became a test pilot himself, inspired by Rachel's example and her ability to make the impossible seem routine, and he credited the transatlantic 892 incident with inspiring his career change and his commitment to advancing aviation safety through experimental flight testing. And somewhere in the skies above America, other test pilots continue pushing the boundaries of flight, developing techniques and knowledge that might someday save lives in ways they can't imagine. Because that's what test pilots do, they fly where others can't go, learn what others don't know, and develop skills that exist at the very limits of human capability and aircraft performance. And sometimes, when 200 lives hang in the balance at 35,000 feet, those impossible skills turn out to be exactly what the world needs most.